Wikicast
Podcast.
So, welcome to the first edition of the Wikicast podcast. I'm your host, Steve O'Gallagher, and my co-host today is Mr. Adam Pollard. Hello, Adam.
Hi,
You're what there? You okay?
Yeah. I'm going to be like the sounding board for Steve's topic this week.
Yeah. He's the yin to my yang. And is this your first time doing anything in front of a microphone?
I think it is. It's the first time I think I've ever spoken into one.
It is odd. You do feel like the microphone is a giant eye that's just looking at you.
Particularly this microphone.
And judging. Criticizing. So this first podcast, I thought it would be good to have a sort of introduction of sorts. Because the Wikicast podcast is going to bring you information from the wonderful wealth that is Wikipedia. And it's going to be about everything in the universe ever. Every podcast will have its own subject or topic. It can be one about the beginning of the universe, which will be our next podcast. It could be one about the British Empire. It could be a whole podcast about penguins. There could be a whole podcast about Justin Bieber. There won't be a whole podcast about Justin Bieber, but we could if we wanted to, because basically anything that's on Wikipedia is fair game. So it should be fun, and every week should be a completely different subject, which would be interesting.
With some pretty interesting tangents, I imagine.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, we don't really know everything about the universe ever, and even Wikipedia's got a lot.
We're willing to concede that.
That's fine. We weren't there when everything happened, so some of it's going to be guessing, some of it's going to be just yakking about what we think about stuff. But we will try and endeavor to drop as many actual facts in there as possible to be somewhat informative. But even Wikipedia can be wrong, so the whole thing is just going to be...
The basis for our knowledge.
Yeah, is errored at best. But it should be fun, it'll be interesting, and you might actually learn something as you go along, which is the intention, really. But this podcast, I thought, would be apt to be about podcasts.
Yeah.
Makes sense? Introduction to the structure of this, because... Like, I played in various rock bands in the past, and hip-hop bands, and metal bands, and ska bands, and I like to think that, well, actually, it's definite that every single gig, someone would be there seeing my band for the first time. But also, every once in a while, someone at our gig would be seeing a gig for the first time. So this could be someone's first ever podcast. Has that slightly melted your brain?
I hadn't in any way considered that this was a historically significant event.
For someone, potentially, it could happen. So if you don't know what a podcast is, according to Wikipedia, a podcast is a series of digital media files, either audio or video, that are released episodically, great word, by the way, and often downloaded through web syndication. That is way too big a word for what it actually is. Basically, it's just a series of audio podcasts, just a series of audio episodes that you can download and listen to at any time. It's kind of like the radio, only it's not live streaming. You can listen to it as and when you like.
I mean, generally there is a lot more talking. It's more like...
It's
like talk radio, rather
Yeah,
than...
essentially. We are BBC Radio 4.
Yeah.
And you can listen to it at any time.
In Steve's bedroom.
In my bedroom, with two mics in our faces. But I was looking up on the Wikipedia page about podcasts, and there's a couple of interesting little factoids I'd found. People think, generally, or at least I did, that podcasting is kind of close to iPod, and that's why the term came about, because you can listen to it, download it onto your iPod, and then listen to it.
I assumed that's where it came from.
It's
entirely.
Not.
Oh.
There's our first little factoid of the whole series.
It pod as in capsule?
No, but that would be brilliant.
Almost
like a time capsule.
Little capsules of knowledge?
Apparently, the term podcasting was first mentioned by Ben Hammersley in The Guardian newspaper in a February 2004 article.
It would be The Guardian.
It would, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Along with other proposed names to the medium. It is a portmanteau of the word pod. I didn't realize that's what that was. I thought that was an acronym. Is that right? Acronym? Because it's saying that pod, an acronym for playable on demand.
Oh.
So that's what.
Yeah,
podcast.
acronym. Yeah.
But then where does cast come? I guess. Cast comes from broadcasting. So it's a playable on demand broadcast, a podcast.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why we think it's to do with Apple is because it says here the name may be misleading, as despite the etymology, it has never been necessary to use an iPod or indeed any other form of
So
portable media player.
podcasts predate iPods.
I don't know if they predate them, but I know that they predate iTunes being able to distribute podcasts and suggesting that you could put it onto your iPod.
Yeah, I suppose what's misleading is so many things have now adopted
That's true.
as thing, and that clearly comes from Apple. The iPod, the iPad, the iThing, the iPlayer we have now.
Yeah.
So,
But, I mean, that kind of does stand to reason, though, because you have the iPhone, and Apple didn't invent phone, so you can have an iPod, but they didn't invent
I've always
pod.
assumed it was interactive. I've always assumed that's just been an assumption on my part.
I mean, interactive.
Interactive. Phone.
Interactive.
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 Interactive phone or interactive pod. Maybe.
Oh,
not.
really? I thought it was.
That's kind of what I assumed.
I thought it was internet,
Internet pod.
which I guess.
Yeah,
and then
no,
internet phone.
I was always an assumption on my part. But then I
Interactive.
think it could probably. It
Well,
probably
an
doesn't
iPod
mean
isn't really
anything.
that interactive. But even the iPod isn't saying like an iPodcast. It's an MP3 player.
We've
But,
already been defeated by our lack of knowledge.
Wikipedia can't answer this for us, unfortunately, because we're asking very, very odd questions. Apparently the use of the term podcast predates the addition of native support for podcasting to the iPod or Apple's iTunes software. To avoid a term suggestive of iPod, some use the term netcast instead of podcast. I've never heard anyone say netcast.
No, maybe I have.
Really?
Or I would assume if I heard the word netcast,
You'd know what that meant.
I'd assume it was someone being a bit dickish in reading podcast.
They don't want to say podcast.
Yeah.
Because podcast does sound a little like, let's play Dungeons and Dragons in my parents' basement. Like, Jay, do you want to be in my podcast?
Yeah,
Totally
As well as-
cool.
I don't know. I think of pods as futuristic.
Like those chairs in Men in Black. Those white
Yeah,
pod
or
chairs.
like those pod hotels you've got in Japan
pod people.
and stuff. Pod people.
That's quite future, isn't it? The Pod People. It's like a horror thriller film.
Never heard of it.
You've never heard of the Pod People?
No.
You're kidding.
Is this going on our list of things to watch?
Yeah, we could do a podcast about what are they called? Those horror, like B-movie horror films. There's a name for them. Goroscopes? No.
I think I know what you mean. Like films like 666.
Creature
Route
features.
666.
Creature feature.
No, never. I mean, to be honest, I've never really watched that many horror films. I think I watched The Haunting, and that was enough.
The Haunt. That wasn't. Was that
was
the
a
Haunted
12.
Mansion? With like.
Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Yes.
Yes.
Was Brendan Fraser in that one?
Who?
The dude from The Mummy.
Yes.
Ha! Yeah, I saw that. That was a little bit freaky. But
Yeah.
yeah, we would have been about 12 when that came
Well,
out.
it,
Actually, I would have been about 14, which is a bit embarrassing to be scared of that.
I didn't enjoy that, and I made my decision. No more horror films.
Yeah, do you know, there's a film called Paranormal Activity.
Fucking loved that film,
Really?
but I didn't find it that scary.
Because, see, I haven't seen
I don't
it.
think of that as a horror film. I think of that as like a mockumentary.
Yeah, but it's a horror mockumentary. I mean, clearly
is.
the idea is horror. Because when people talk to me about that film, they say, oh, I saw this film called Paranormal Activity. It's amazing. I couldn't sleep for a couple of days. You should totally watch it. And then I go, no thanks. I'd rather sleep.
I thought it was really cool. It is definitely worth. I slept very well the evening of.
Really?
It was good. It had there's just some quite cool effects in it. You just think, it's a
I've heard the whole movie described, and it sounds clever and quirky, kind of like the Blair Witch Project
Yeah.
was. But yeah,
I enjoyed it much more than I've watched quite a few horror films actually. I enjoyed it a lot more than the Blair Witch Project, which I just thought was like a little bit too mocky
I
on the
haven't
mockumentary scale.
seen either. Really, I'm not really a big fan of horror films. I don't enjoy being scared shitless. It's not how I get my kicks, unless it's a roller coaster ride and I know I'll be safe, or if it's a really good kind of thriller film. And I know that everything's fine, really, because it's all special effects. But if the idea is to scare the hell out of you, then
I don't know. I suppose
I'd rather watch Anchorman
being
again.
terrified can be fun. I'm not a fan of the Saw genre though. The human centipede-esque films.
Oh, right. So gore.
Anything
pure
that's
gore
like
stuff.
unnecessarily gory, scary. There's no need for that. So what other tidbits have you got on podcasts?
That is a fantastic little tangent. Yes, podcasts. So apparently in June 2005, Apple released iTunes 4.9 with support for podcasts for the first time. While this made receiving podcasts